All right. I end up voting affirmative in this debate. I'm ultimately not persuaded that the version of education that you're promoting is a better version of education than what the affirmative is promoting in this debate round. And I think that a lot of it is because you don't end up spending as much time as you need to with your evidence that talks about legal reform being good and the futurism type arguments, right? Because your legal reform being good argument begs the question of if the legal education that we could get here is then able to do something that's positive in order to figure out how to be able to challenge the system, which means that you need to win a debate that challenging the system is beneficial and that working with the system reform is desirable, right? When you don't answer the futurism arguments about how that ends up being like a system that ends up being co-opted, that just becomes a form of pinkwashing that recreates homo-nationalism, which leads to other impacts, then that form of education becomes a negative form of education, right? So I think that in terms of going for framework, you're emphasizing the wrong standard to be able to get my ballot, and I think that your competitive equity standards or stuff like that you have in the block would be more persuasive if you're not going to have more of an emphasis in that 2 and R about the legal education being good and a productive mode in order to help make the world better, which requires you to have more on that level of the debate opposed to like the link level of the debate for where your ground's being lost. I think that the way that the 2 and R goes down, you have more ground loss type arguments, but your impacts don't line up with those sort of arguments, which means you're not connecting them in connection with one of them beneficially. And when you're like, this is not about future, this is not about the future, it's about what happens in the space, but then your impact is about how the education creates something in the future, it's like, I don't know how to resolve those things, right? Because if it is about just the space, then you could totally be like, that links us out of the future, we're pushed out of this round right here and now, that means you don't have to evaluate the future, and that's how your ground competitive equity arguments make more sense in that world. And so I think that's the twist that takes place. Otherwise, yeah, I'm not really sure if it's about the space, then what is the education?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and then in terms of like the co-option argument in the case that you're going for, I think you definitely win a link of co-option, but I think the affirmative is right that like co-option is like, they're not trying to resolve all forms of co-option, right? It being negative within the space means that we're able to shatter and be able to break that down, and that's going to be positive. The other thing that you all don't point out that I think is easy to point out is that on framework, you make the argument that co-option is inevitable. This is why we need to work through the law. The case argument you extend is a co-option argument.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think that you all should be focusing on the entirety of the round, is that their arguments, when they kick out of positions, they say you can't extend offense, but they've read impacts that impact turn framework relatively clearly, right? Like the choir stuff about how if we focus upon the way that, embodiment matters, the way that racial composition matters when we talk about things like sexuality, all assumes that we shouldn't have this framing type question. Their cap K, when they kick out of it just by extending the permutation, your arguments are about the reasons for why your affirmative solves this approach, gets to the underlying grid of this, and then they're reading impacts about how capitalism is at the root of all violence, which means a legal reform strategy would not be able to solve this, right? So the way that they kick out of the positions, I think allows you to be able to utilize that offense, and I think that you two need to play more with the interactions between the flows than you do, opposed to addressing each flow individually, and allow them to kick out in like a 2-3 second kick out, and then you don't get any sort of ability to capitalize off it. Likewise, you need to be able to kick out with things, more clearly, so that way you don't get those sort of residual offense coming back. And if the game is about getting to framework at the end, you need the 2 and R being like, framework becomes before all sorts of impact arguments and assessments, because it's always a prerequisite to be able to talk about whether these impacts are good or bad. We can't evaluate the impacts are good or bad if we lose the educational class to be able to challenge these things. At the same time, I think that the counter advocacy, like the counterplan tax, is a much better 2 and R strategy. I buy a lot of the 1 and R arguments on the debate about like why, like the one card that they read that talks about how queerness is not enough without talking about queerness, you point out doesn't mention queerness whatsoever, and it's just a card about blackness, right? Like I haven't read the card, but if you're right on that, that seems like the one piece of offense they might have against you doesn't apply, and then the only thing you really have to get past then becomes the question of the permutation, where they say they don't understand queerness as an identity, but rather it's an ontological position, and we have this ideological form. But Johnson is writing very much about the way that when people just utilize queerness as this like vacuous category that everyone could be able to move in and out of, that it ignores specifically those embodied identities that we must be able to pay attention to and focus on, which is what the 1 and R are extensions of it. So I think you're ahead on that debate substantively, and I don't think like the 1 and R necessarily beats it back. Like there's some arguments about like how assemblages and how we can pull that together, but I think that with 6 minutes on that, I think you can persuade me back to that, and I think you use framework to be like, at least give us leeway on these forms of arguments in the world that you think that we are winning some sort of link and there's a difference between here. You should not pay attention to the permutation, and then our counter advocacy solves for everything they do, but does it through the lens of queerness, which is better. And I'd be willing to give leeway. I'm way more likely to give leeway in rounds where you feel that you have ground lost than I am to like necessarily pull the trigger fully against them. So I think utilizing framework and procedural arguments as a way to get some ground back in the debate makes sense in this instance. And I think that they ask you the question of what is queerness, but I think that you should strategically, if you're going to run this counter advocacy, I think you should ask the question, what is queerness first, and then write down those answers from the 1AC, and then you can explain why those answers for how they define queerness shows how they're utilizing it as this universalizing category that doesn't pay attention to the distinctions between queer and queer, between black and white, and who has the ability to identify just as queerness in terms of this vacuous form of terminology. And I think that becomes a useful way to then set up that counter advocacy and stuff like that as well. And I think that would be valuable in order to be able to do that. I also think that given time allocation of the 2AC, if you are going to go for framework, right? I don't know if that is your strategy coming to this round. It seems like it might have been. Shadow extending capitalism, given the amount of time the 2AC spends on it, is probably going to be a big time suck for the 1AR, which means that you have less stuff to worry about on the framework flow, which makes it easier for you. I do understand why you end up going for framework, because I do think that is not I think that a lot of the internal standards are not being directly answered by the 1AR, and I think that I understand your double bind switch side argument, right? You should be prepared either way, right? But I don't think that it answers. You spend more time on that argument than that argument would actually get you in the debate round, because a lot of their standards doesn't really matter if they are necessarily prepared to debate it, but it's also the necessity in order to be able to flip back and forth, so that way we can self-interrogate, play the devil's advocate, and all those other sort of things. So I don't think it gets out of their articulations of switch sides. So I think you spend more time there than is necessary, and I think that while I like your counter interpretation, the spirit, have to be in the spirit. I think that you then, when you say, well, it basically could be anything, I think you then eliminate out the power of it, right? To be in the spirit means that you have to have some argument for how it is germane and reasonable within the topic, which is sort of the 2AC explanation of it, but I think that doesn't necessarily clearly get extended in the 1AR, and I think that spirit at least creates some reasonable limits for where they should be able to come prepared to this debate to then talk about the ways in which these things could be promoted, it could be challenged in the context of the debate. So I think that it's worth having a more rigorous defense of that counter interpretation throughout the debate in order to be able to have that extension. And I think that some of the technical precision in the 1AR that's missing is what would allow for if they go for just fairness type arguments, there's not as much of a big push as there is in fairness versus education, because I do agree with the 2AR that you lucked out. They went for the education standard, which is where you have the most of the 1AR and 2AC articulations. In the world where they go for fairness and competitive equity, you have some, but I think you're much lighter on those sort of questions, right? Because the stasis point that you create, that is a stasis point that would create after my ballot is constructed or other ballots take place, which is a little bit too late to have the engagement with the round that we need to be able to take place, which means that I don't know if that's beneficial. And it also seems a little bit futuristic in the fact that once I vote, then there'll be this stasis point, and then we have these debates, which seems to be sort of future thinking about what's going to take place in future rounds. So I don't know if that argument is the best argument. I do like the articulation about the ballot is meant to be sort of a non-normative conception of the way the debate goes down. But I think that the limits arguments paired with fairness, you could probably get my ballot on framework come the 2NR, because I think that you are demonstrating different things that will be able to take place. But I also think that when you explain the topical version of the AF, that the withdrawal of troops, you could also be able to explain the type of ground that you could get in relationship to their affirmative. So for instance, if they topically withdraw troops as an act of queer negativity, you can make arguments about how troop presence is necessary in order to be able to protect gay rights or LGBTQ rights in in Iraq or in the country, in various different countries where gay rights are being crushed and being gay is criminal and there's death, right? And that's their evidence is obviously an impact turn to these things, right? Because they're saying these sort of pinkwashing is bad, but they don't even allow the debate over whether or not we should use the military to promote gay rights, right? And so then you could be the type of education that we would lose is specifically this type of education on the question of pinkwashing, because we can't question if promoting gay rights through the military is a desirable strategy if you won't even defend the removal of gay rights, which means the type of debate that you want to have, we're denied access to in this instance, right? Because we can't get up here and say military is good to promote gay rights because you don't remove the military, so that doesn't create that traction. And I think that if you frame your educational arguments that way, then you're able to get your educational arguments in relationship to the type of education the affirmative thinks is important, which then could bring it back, then makes it easier to see how the educational value that you're getting is desirable. Devil's advocate stuff, good. I think that that's potentially that's one of the areas where I think I focus that in terms of trying to evaluate whether the education is good or bad that you're promoting. That's one of the standards that you have that I think is that I spend more time evaluating. But I ultimately don't think you're doing enough work there for how that self-interrogation process is necessary to promote the education that they're talking that they want, and then you immediately connect it back to sort of policy-making education. But I think that if you read some evidence and make self-interrogation type arguments, doing that devil's advocate, and have the education of devil's advocates being good opposed to policy-making education being good, that could be a better internal to the education type arguments as well in the context of this round. That's what I think. Is there questions?
Yeah, so, or, do you have a question first? But, so for the 1 hour, in order to make it maybe more so viable, what would you suggest adding to what was said?
To your pick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that obviously it solves 100%. That's fine. I think that you could do a better job of pulling out the impact level of it. Right? It's obviously that it excludes queer black individuals, right? But I don't necessarily know why that exclusion is problematic outside of I know that it's problematic, right? You're not necessarily doing the work there to explain that. So I think that the impact level of that is useful, and then because then you can also make the arguments that they have nothing to weigh against these impacts, right? And the only thing that they've got is just reasons for why we need to be able to do this for the form of the assemblages. So then if you beat back that length, and then you get those impacts, and then you could be like, even if assemblages might be beneficial in some instances, the better system is to use queerness as that starting base to talk about the assemblages opposed to doing it the other way around. And so I'm not saying a counter perm where you say but I would say that you could say something like they should not get a perm in the relationship to a critical affirmative for where they essentially their entire advocacy is that 1AC, which means that we should be able to criticize and interrogate any of their language. And so when you're just saying it's severance, I think you should also layer it with additional levels of theory about how when you don't have when your advocacy statement is a little bit more vacuous and you have a speech act that you're defending opposed to a policy, we should be able to criticize any element of your discourse and not make it different. And so then it becomes sort of like a starting point debate in terms of what language do we use when we approach the questions of assemblages. The negative advance is that we should use queerness as that approach to assemblages opposed to using queerness as that approach to assemblages. And that difference allows for blackness to be remained at the centerpiece of this analysis opposed to it being just a universal form of whiteness. And then you read your impact cards about why the exclusion of black trans individuals is what undermines the queer movement and doesn't allow the movement to be as strong as it could be. Otherwise. So that would be what I would say. So essentially the impact analysis, and then when answering the permutation, both you don't get a perm, and then also that it should be a question of starting points in relationship to discourse, is the two things that I think that could be utilized. I think you do a good job of answering their evidence. If you're right about it, right, then I think you're doing a good job of answering the cards and stuff like that as well. And then sort of going back to why it's important to have this differential starting point, I think becomes useful.
Okay.
Yep.
That makes sense.
My question was about the 2AC response segment. I was worried about it because I felt like it wasn't adequate. Do you think there were better 2AC? I mean, obviously there are better 2AC responses, but do you think there are 2AC responses that are just obviously missing that you have?
Well, I think that I know that queer was criticized by Asian queers that I forget the term that they utilize as
Where?
Yeah, they use another term, right? And so then you could be like, listen, the point of queerness is that the movement is always going to be building up with new additional terminology. So one, you could read the evidence that says queer is bad because it excludes Asian forms of queerness. And therefore, we should not be getting into these little discursive debates over what term we utilize in these sort of regard. You can also read evidence like, call-out culture or discursive focus is problematic. We have to focus on the ontological questions before discursive questions and sort of creating a sequencing claim. So even if they're right that your discourse is bad, the ontological orientation that the affirmative takes becomes fundamentally more important than sort of a word choice type arguments and stuff like that. I don't know how you feel about theory, but I mean, I'm fine with picks bad. I don't think it's entirely, contradictory to things that you say, depending about how you set that up. And I think a net benefit to the permutation would be nice. And I guess you're using queerness as assemblages card, but I mean, if she's right that your evidence doesn't mention queer, then that is not doing what you need it to do, right? In which case, you could find evidence. I would just say that when reading that evidence, instead of tagging it as independently queer isn't productive, right? Like that's going to be the analysis the 1AR makes out of the card, but when it's tagged like that, the assumption is the card says that, and so when somebody calls that out, it's like, oh, that's not like that. And I'm constantly telling my debaters is that there's a difference between your tagline, which summarizes a card, and your analysis, and it's fine to make analysis out of evidence that doesn't make that argument, but when you make it seem like that's what the card says, it undermines your legitimacy in terms of extending that card. So I think that if you just do analysis from that card, I think it makes it better if that evidence is doing the work that you want it to be in terms of, like, coalitional type of strategies. And then I think you could also read the evidence. It's like queerness is always already blackness, that blackness is already within the position of being queer. So that way, like, because there's plenty of black queer authors who utilize the term queer, right? There's not that many that actually utilize the term queer. And so, pointing out that shows how that these focuses on discourse ends up becoming divisive within the community that doesn't allow for, a positive approach. Also, the easy answer with queer negativity is that you've admitted that negative shit is always going to happen and that we can't have that perfect solution, so we have to be okay with our failures. And so, yes, our language wasn't adequate because there is no language that would ever be adequate. Their attempt to find that perfect language runs counter to the queer negativity that we have to be able to embrace, which is why rejecting you on this argument is problematic and is not an embrace of queer negativity, because it's a stride towards perfection.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think maybe I should have just put it in a different place in the order of 2AC?
Well, I mean, it seems like you didn't have other answers, so it's not like it's not an issue of time allocation. It's an issue of 2AC block, right? And so I think that's a bigger question than stop it. Yeah, so I think that's a bigger question than just sort of time allocation type of issues. So I don't think that you're wrong, but I also think maybe working on some of the cross applications between flows is where you can also save time, and it's also where you could be able to get some more indexes the way that they're understanding the world, especially it could then at least cut down the amount of time that you're spending on framework.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?
No, that makes so much sense to me. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good debate. Thanks for doing it.